Welcome back, I'm Urion. Today we're going to talk about the snare drum, its role, its frequency range, single, layered and staggered snare drums, compression, EQ and reverbs. So the snare, it's the counterweight to the kick. It's the rhythm section's snap or pop value, and it normally is on the second and fourth within a bar. And sometimes the snare, we instead use a clap, or we can have a snare and a clap that are a staggered layered pair. That's very common as well. And tonally, the snare delivers its bulk of energy in a very broad frequency range that lives above the kick drum and below the snare drum, and about 90 to 10K. And if you use like a live sample of a real snare drum, like from a drum set, then it has more bulk energy in the lower regions down the spectrum, around 120 to 250. And a synthetic drum like from the 808 or 909, or the drummer, well, there are many, but those are the most basic ones. But anyway, the bulk of its energy are higher up, around 1K to 1.5K. So that is always quite useful to have knowledge about. So we can use a compressor on a snare drum to shape its initial transient and body. And we can do that to achieve one of two goals. Maybe we want to have a fatter snare that has more transient and less of a body, and then you would, have a slow attack on that one, so that the compressor does not compress the initial transient and then just compress the body. Or the opposite, if you want to have a more smooth snare, you might have a fast attack so that the compressor attacks those initial transients and have like a slower release. So that would give you a more deeper and glued sound. And then if we're talking about layering a snare bus, then you would send maybe the snare and a clap to a snare bus, and using a glue compressor on that one to glue the two sounds together. And you would use like a medium attack, because you want those initial transients to come through, and then have a slow release so that you would compress the two bodies together. So equalizing a snare, we can define three sections for the as a frequency band. So they have the low, the mid, and the high. And the lower frequencies, 90 hertz to say 350, we can define as the low part. And at around 120 to 350 is the critical part, where the body of the snare lives, because the snare is not only mid, it's actually it features quite a lot of body actually. And so this is an important section as well. And if you want to increase the weight of a snare drum, then it can benefit from a 1 to 2 dB increasement in this area. In order to find where to increase, you can do with a sweeping technique and finding where does the snare pop in this region. And then also in the lower bottom end, we can benefit from a low cut at some point. Start at around maybe say 90 hertz and listen by ear where does it not make any difference anymore, and where does the muddiness go away, because it can be a lot of muddy down here. And if you would like to have maybe like a crispier snare, then you could EQ out even more, say up to maybe 220 or something like that. But I would be careful with cutting too much, but it depends on the overall mix. So, excuse me. So the mid section, and in the mid section, the lower part, we start from 350 to 800 is the mid section, and the lower part, 350 to 500, it can sound quite boxy, and often it's quite beneficial to actually cut a little bit here, and then from 1 to 4.5K lies the crack, the sharp attack, which actually, kind of like defines a snare. And I would be very careful with doing any increasement here, because already a snare has a lot of energy in this region. So you can actually reduce a little bit if you find that your snare is maybe a bit harsh. And then we have the high end, 4.5K and upwards. And this is where you have the presence and dominance, and in the lower part of this region. And from 10K and upward is where we have the airy sounds. And you can concentrate more energy in this region. If you find that your snare drum is not cutting through, maybe if you have a lot of high-end sounds like hi-hats and cymbals and stuff like that, then maybe you need to boost up here actually to get the snare drum to cut through the mix. The snare drum is the most commonly layered sound or drum sound within electronic music, and they can be layered or staggered. Now, layered is when you have two different sound, maybe a live sample and a drum machine, and they are layered on top of each other, and you EQing, maybe you take the top from one and the bottom from another. Or you have staggered, and that's where you have many, or you have layered but also spread out in time. So you have kind of like an effect with a little groove. Maybe you have a snare and then you have a clap that's coming a few milliseconds after in time. So one thing that often becomes a problem with the snare is the fact that the kick drum has it's so rich in its frequencies, and the snare can become lost in the mix due to the dominance of the kick, basically. And we have several different techniques to tackle this issue, and in the second part we are going to do this hands-on. Also, what I talked before on EQ and compression, and all of these things are things that we will touch upon on the compressor. So even if it maybe flown by your head, I'm keeping notes as well. That's a lot of information to keep. But when it comes down to it, it's quite basic in the end, and it's all quite rational. But anyway, I can mention here that we can use EQ to roll away frequencies of the snare. So maybe the unwanted lows. We can also shift the snare in time. I always do that, like move the snare a little bit so it doesn't play exactly on the second, because it's actually quite a nice little swing, and that way the transient of the kick has room, and then the snare comes a few milliseconds after that. And besides those two, you can also widen the layer of the snare. Now, you do want to have a snare always in the center to give that bulk of the energy, but you can have like a layered snare where you have some snares out in the stereo field, which gives the snare more dominance and presence, and then we leave one in the center to, so we have that center, all important center snare. So it's rare to find a reverb on the kick in most genres within electronic. Now there are some that do, maybe some hard techno and stuff like that can actually use some reverb on their kick. It's quite colorful. But snare on or reverb on the snare is almost a given. And we use a technique on the snare specifically where, depending on the tempo of your track, you put a timer on how long you will allow the snare to be open, or reverb to be open, and basically you want it to be shut before the next beat starts. If you recall back to the compression section, it's kind of like the release we were talking about. You want it to be closed before the next one comes, otherwise it will become it's just flopping about. You want to have this controlled kind of suction movement with the snare. And there are a few other techniques as well, or stuff. You should control the bottom end of the reverb so it doesn't clog up your mix and results in a muddy nightmare. And then you can use echoes on a snare as well, and maybe cut maybe an echo like the Roland RE201 Space Echo. There are a couple of emulations for that one as well. The typical one that you can do, you're doing some dubby stuff, then it can be quite cool to have an echo on a snare and have like a kind of like a ghosty groove going on, maybe cutting the top half of the echoes. So stay tuned for the part 2. I'm going to release that in the next couple of days, so keep an eye out open for that. And then until next time, thank you for watching, and don't forget the like and all of those things. All right, guys, bye, and girls, bye. Hey.